What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2008 Mercedes-Benz W211 E63 AMG. Today on the W211 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your fuel injectors. This DIY is going to be applicable to all vehicles equipped with an M156 engine. Now, while they are not as prone to failure as they are on the M113, they still have been known to fail and cause an engine to hydrolock, whereas on the M113 drivetrain, it's a lot more of a common problem. Today we're using our Bosch fuel injectors. These are OE units that are available on fcpeuro.com. We recommend you replace them about every 70,000 miles just as safe, cheap insurance, as it's way easier to replace a fuel injector than it would be a whole engine. But with that being said, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. For this DIY, we're going to be using a 1/4-inch drive ratchet. We have an electric ratchet as well. I have a 17mm wrench. I'm using a flared wrench today for the fuel line. However, a standard wrench will work just fine. I have a small right angle pick, a flathead screwdriver. We have a long extension for the 1/4-inch ratchet with a T30 and a T25. I will also be using the CTA flexible driver, which is a 6mm unit. This is going to come in handy for some of the clamps versus using a flathead screwdriver. And we have a pair of flush cuts and some zip ties. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we are going to start under the hood of the W211. To get started, we're going to work on removing our beauty covers and our air boxes. So let's get started with that. First things first, I like to start on either end of this front cover, reach underneath and push up on the tabs where they attach to the air boxes. Just kind of pop them up a little bit. Same thing on the other side. And then we can pop it off the rest of the way. Next, we're going to work on removing these two little beauty covers over our mass airflow sensors. Unplug our sensors. These just pop off. On the passenger side bank, your release tab is underneath the sensor. You squeeze and pull back. On the driver's side bank, it is located on top of the sensor, so they're just reversed. I'll take a 6mm hex. You can use a flathead screwdriver or a 6mm bit on a ratchet. We're just going to undo the hose clamps that hold our air boxes to the intake. Now from there, we're going to grab our T25. I'm going to use a T25 on an electric ratchet, and we have 5 screws to undo from each lid. On the driver's bank, the one is behind the air box is right by the fuel line. The other one's going to be right by the dipstick. Simply lift up the air box and pull out. Set these to the side. We'll do the same thing on the passenger side bank now. And just lift up and pull out. Now we have both air boxes removed. We can go ahead and remove the lower portion. These are just kind of clipped into the motor. You can just lift up on them and pull them back. We'll do the same thing on the other bank. There we go. Set these to the side. From there, we have these protective insulating pads on either side of the rail that you're just going to want to simply pull up gently and pull out. These can deteriorate a little bit as they get older with age, so you want to try not to make a mess of them or destroy them. There's one, there's two. I'm just going to keep these up here so I don't mix up which bank is for which. Now, the next step is going to be to remove this intake plenum. This Y piece connects to the throttle body down below, so there's a tab on either end or a release clip that you're going to want to pull to separate this from that. Just be very gentle with it. You don't want to break it. And they're a little bit hard to see, but once you reach down there, you can feel them. So let's go ahead and get this off next. With that released, all we have left to do is to remove this vacuum line elbow. Just be very gentle with it. If it's not coming, you can give it a bit of a twist. These are the two tabs that clip onto the sides of the, we call it a throttle body, but it's really just the port into the whole intake system. Call it what you like, my good people. These are the tabs. Be gentle with them. Set this to the side. Just as insurance, I'm going to take a couple shop towels and just place them down there in the port. I don't want anything falling in there by accident while we're working around here. This electrical connector and this vacuum line can just be tucked back to the side, out of the way. And same thing with our mass airflow sensor on the other side. Just tuck it back out of the way. With that removed, we're going to want to go ahead and disconnect our fuel pressure sensor up here at the rail. Just a regular electrical tab to push down. Pull back, Sometimes I like to push into the connector and then pull back. It helps release them. Now at this point, it'd be helpful to release some of the fuel pressure in the rail. What I recommend is you take off the bleeder cap valve that's usually on this side of the passenger side bank up front. There's a pressure release valve there. Ours is missing, as you can tell, but the valve is still there. We're gonna put a towel down. We'll use maybe a small flathead screwdriver or a small pick to just depress that valve for a moment. Some fuel should come out. That'll keep us from making too much of a big mess when we pull everything out. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and release that fuel pressure. I have an old shop towel. I have a small flathead screwdriver. I'm gonna cover up the area as best as possible so I don't get fuel on myself or all over the place. And we'll just hear for that sweet, sweet release. Cool, not a whole lot came out. That's great. All right, my good people, next we're gonna go ahead and disconnect our fuel line from the fuel rail. Now this may depend on what model you have, where the location of this line will be. On the E63, it's gonna be located right here on the back driver's side corner. So I'm gonna use a shop towel, same one we used earlier. Just kind of lay it down here. To break this, you're gonna need a 17mm wrench. I'm using a flared wrench, which wraps around the fitting a little bit better, just to avoid stripping anything. However, a regular wrench will work just fine. Once I get my wrench on here, I'm gonna wrap the towel around it, just in case any fuel sprays out. We can keep from taking a bath in fuel. Okay. I think we'll be okay. Should be able to get the rest of it by hand. A little bit of fuel came out. Let's go ahead and prop that up there. I'll leave my wrench on it to kind of weigh it down from flopping over to us when we're working. Beautiful. Now with that situated, we're going to want to go ahead and remove the 4 T30s that hold our fuel rail to the manifold. We're going to gently pop it up a bit and continue disconnecting some electrical connectors, as well as removing some electrical harnesses that are tabbed into it. Now before we go ahead and release the fuel injectors from the manifold, I'm going to take some compressed air and just blow out all the ports, just to make sure there's no debris in there that may fall into our cylinder chambers afterwards. So just a little bit of shop air will do. Now we can go ahead and gently pull up on the fuel rail. We can start on one bank and then work ourselves to the other bank, and just separate it enough so that we can lift it and start disconnecting our fuel injectors from the electrical harness. That's the other. Now I'm just going to grab a small pick tool and we'll start disconnecting our fuel injectors from the harness. All right, I'm going to be using a small 90-degree pick to help me release the connectors from the fuel injectors. What I like to do is I reach by the front and I release the tab, and then I pull back and the connector comes off. We're going to go ahead and repeat the process all the way down this fuel rail, and same on the other side. You can also separate the harness from the fuel rail. Traditionally, it's held in by a couple factory zip ties right here, which we will replace once we assemble everything together. Someone's been here before and cut these out, but we'll go ahead and replace it with some fresh ones when we reinstall everything. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing on the passenger side bank. Now we want to free up this vacuum line from the intake manifold, mainly on this rear half. It's held in by a couple speed nuts, just so that we can have some room to clear our fuel rail. Gently pull up on either end of the speed nut, and they just kind of pop up. Some of these you can bend if they are too tight. Some of them have been moved already, so someone's been in here before. Now I'm going to take my shop towel. I'm going to do my best to catch the fuel that comes out of the fuel rail as I start moving this around. But we're basically going to work on pulling this out of our engine. Once we pull this out, like this, we're going to head over to the workbench and we'll show you how to swap out the injectors and put in our fresh new Bosch units. All right, my good people, we have the fuel rail on the bench. Looking at these injectors, you can see there's quite a bit of carbon buildup on them. They're quite grimy, quite dirty, so definitely not a bad thing to replace these compared to the nice new fresh units that are going to be going in. Now, it's definitely a good reason to replace these simply based on the looks. Of course, we already know that these fail and tend to be stuck open, so just an added bonus of replacing the injector. Compared to these new ones, these old ones look pretty terrible. These are all held in by a metal locking clip. I like to use a flathead screwdriver to release the clip and then pull the injector out and put in our new one. Just using a flathead screwdriver, set that to the side. And the goal here is to pull out the old injector and insert the new one in the same orientation. Now that we have the old fuel injector out, we're going to go ahead and insert our new one. Oftentimes, I like to use a little bit of lubricant when I'm inserting these, mainly to avoid pinching an O-ring and causing a fuel leak. So what I like to use is something that won't deteriorate the O-ring. I like to use a little bit of dielectric grease, and I put the most minimal tab on it. It's a very small amount. Go ahead and just coat the ring on the outside. Try to avoid getting it in the actual injector itself. And we'll go ahead and reinstall it into our fuel rail. Make sure you support the fuel rail, you don't want to bend it. And it should go in nice and smoothly. Give it a couple twists very gently if you need to seat it fully, but you should be able to feel it go in. Then you take your metal clip, line it back up, and lock it back in. There you go, the fuel injector is replaced. It's in the same orientation. Our clip is secured. If you're not sure what that clip is actually doing, there's a very small groove on the body of the fuel injector that it keys into. So that helps kind of keep everything aligned, and it works in hand with this notch to keep it angled in the right direction. So with that one done, we're gonna go ahead and blast through the other 7, and then we'll get ready to reinsert our fuel rail back into the engine. Boom, baby. There we have it. We have 8 fresh fuel injectors ready to go in our fuel rail. Now, let's head back to the M156 and feed this back in. All right, my good people. Now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our fuel rail. We have it all set up with all 8 new injectors. And just as an added ease of install, if you will, I went ahead and lubricated the O-rings with a little bit of that dielectric grease so that when we go to install it back in the ports, they sit in nicely. They don't get pinched. So similar to our removal, we're going to feed it below this vacuum line very gently. Obviously now we have new injectors. We want to be careful with them. The old ones we weren't too worried about. We're happy with that. Now what we're going to go ahead and do is reconnect all our electrical connectors. I recommend you work your way from the rearward injector up on each rail. That way you have some slack to move the whole harness around. So let's do that. These just plug in the same way we pull them off. No need for any special tools or clips. They're just going to clip right in. That satisfying click, that's how you know they're in. Doesn't hurt to support the body of the fuel injector if you're having a hard time clipping it in. Now I'm going to go ahead to the other side and do the same thing. All right, and while we have this up nice and loose here, we can go ahead and replace the zip ties that hold the harness against the fuel rail. So let's go ahead and do that before we tuck it back down into the intake manifold. Now with the rail situated, we can go ahead and squish this side back into the intake manifold. Just make sure your ports are lined up for all 4 injectors on this side. You'll feel a satisfying engagement with all 4 O-rings seating into the manifold, and both tabs should be level on the intake manifold for the hardware to go back into. So With that side done, we're going to go ahead and button up our harness on the other side and do the same thing. Now we can line up the injectors on this side and squeeze them into their home. If you're unsure or you're not happy with how they seated, simply pull them back up and reseat them again. Now let's grab our Torx bolts and we'll go ahead and snug all 4 down so that our rail can sit in place, and then we'll continue to button up everything else. Now we're going to take our 4 T30s and just get them started by hand. Mercedes-Benz wants 9 Newton meters to torque these down. Since it's such a little amount of torque, we're just going to use the old calibrated wrist to snug them up today, because it's not a lot of force that these require. All right, with that bolted down, now we can go ahead and resecure this vacuum line that we freed up from the manifold earlier. Again, it's just kind of held on by those speed nuts. You simply pop it back into place very gently. You don't want to crack it or break it. All right, we have that secured. We have all our electrical on the fuel rail secured. We have our pressure sensor plugged back in. Next, we're going to go ahead and reattach our fuel line. Again, this was a 17 millimeter for the head. Don't be concerned if a little bit of fuel spills out, as we had some kind of surfacing up here when we pulled it off. Always start it by hand before you tighten it down. Then we can take our 17 and snug it down. Now, if you have some sort of crow's foot you could use if you wanted to torque this, the torque spec for this is 20 Newton meters, not a lot. We're just gonna go ahead and snug ours up. Beautiful. Now that our fuel line's reattached, we can start reassembling the rest of the components, starting with these insulation pads that sit over the fuel rail on either side. If you have your cover still or your cap for the bleeder valve, I recommend you put that on now as well before you forget. All right, with these 2 guys buttoned up, next we can install the lower portions of our airbox. These have 3 nubs that hold them in place. The bigger one is on the cylinder head, and then these 2 smaller ones are in the intake manifold. You just have 3 studs that hold them into place. The front just keys in to the shrouding up front for the air. All right, let's do the same thing to the other side. Beautiful. Now we can take out our shop towel or rag, should you be following along at home. And we can reinstall this Y plenum piece for our air boxes. The goal is to put it on evenly so that both of these tabs lock on at the same time. You should be able to hear them both click. There we go, nice and secure. Now we can grab the rest of our air boxes and get those installed. There we got our driver's side bank lid. Go ahead and feed that into the Y plenum first, and kind of key it into place. Then we'll take our 5 T25s and get them started by hand. I'm just going to use the electric ratchet to snug these down. They don't need a lot of torque. Just once they bottom out, that's all it needs, since they're just going into plastic. At this point, you can plug back in your mass airflow sensor, reinstall the little beauty cover over it, and tighten down your clamp. Again, I'm using a 6 millimeter driver. However, a flathead screwdriver will do the job just fine. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and do the exact same thing on the passenger side bank. And last but not least, we have the final beauty cover piece, which is gonna go right up front. And there you have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward job on the M156, and definitely cheap insurance for the type of job that this is and the type of effects that this can have should the injectors fail. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.